The tracks were grinding metal against frozen mud. Not the sound of movement, the sound of something breaking inside the transmission. Rybalko's hand was on the hatch, feeling vibrations that shouldn't be there, and his driver was looking at him with an expression that said they had maybe 10 minutes before the gearbox seized completely. 43 tanks were supposed to cross this ridge before dawn, and dawn was coming in 90 minutes whether the lead tank moved or not. The temperature gauge was climbing past the red line. Engine heat was pooling under the armour, turning the crew compartment into a steel oven, and the smell of burning oil was mixing with exhaust fumes in a way that meant gaskets were failing. Rybalko counted seconds. The German observation post was 3 kilometres north, and if his column was still visible on this ridge when the sun came up, artillery would find them within minutes. His driver's hands were shaking on the controls. Not from cold, from the decision he was being asked to make. Push the engine past failure and hope it lasted long enough, or stop now and strand 42 tanks behind him in a killing zone with no cover. The next tank in line was 20 metres back, waiting. Commanders were watching through their periscopes. Everyone knew what stopping meant. Rybalko had a name that German intelligence officers were starting to recognise in intercepted radio traffic. Colonel General Pavel Alexeyevich Rybalko, Tank Army Commander. The German reports called his tactics reckless and suicidal, which was German for effective. His formations moved at speeds that Soviet doctrine said were impossible, covering distances that made staff officers check their maps twice and appearing in places where tank armies weren't supposed to exist. The transmission made a sound like tearing metal. The driver's foot came off the throttle, an instinctive reaction to mechanical death, and Rybalko's hand was on his shoulder before the tank fully stopped. They had 40 minutes of darkness left. The German artillery would need 15 minutes to range find once they had visual confirmation. That left 25 minutes to either fix a transmission that couldn't be fixed, or convince 43 tank crews that they were moving forward, regardless of what physics said was possible. The crew compartment smelled like hot metal and fear. Rybalko's gunner was checking ammunition counts, a nervous habit that meant he was calculating survival odds, and the loader was watching the commander with an expression that said he'd follow orders but wanted desperately to hear what those orders would be. Outside, through the vision slit, Rybalko could see the lead elements of the German defensive line. Earthworks, machine gun positions, the dark shapes of anti-tank guns dug into positions that commanded every approach. The radio was crackling with traffic from the tanks behind him. Voices asking for orders. Voices asking what was happening. Voices with the careful neutrality of men who knew their commander might be making a decision that would. The transmission was making sounds that no transmission should make, metal grinding against metal with nothing left to lubricate the contact, and he engaged first gear with the careful precision of someone handling explosives. The tank lurched forward. The grinding sound got worse. Temperature gauges climbed into ranges that maintenance manuals said meant immediate shutdown, and Rybalko was counting the number of tanks that started moving behind him. 42 shapes emerging from cover, following a lead vehicle that was mechanically dying but still moving. The German observation post must have seen them. Radio discipline meant Rybalko couldn't hear the enemy transmissions, but he could imagine them. Frantic reports about Soviet armour moving in darkness, coordinates being called out, artillery batteries being roused from sleep to service their guns. The race was simple mathematics now. His tanks needed to cover 3 kilometres before German artillery could achieve firing solutions. 3 kilometres across open ground with a transmission that was failing and an engine that was overheating and a column not on Rybalko's position, behind it, which meant the German calculations were off, or their intelligence was outdated, or they were firing blind. The explosions lit up the ridge he'd just crossed, turning frozen mud into fountains of dirt and shrapnel, and Rybalko was already adjusting his route, angling northeast instead of north, changing the vector in a way that would force German gunners to recalculate. His transmission seized, Rybalko keyed the radio and gave orders that were identical to the previous orders, except now he was in a different tank and the mathematics of the race had changed slightly. German machine gun fire started at the 1 kilometre mark, tracers arcing across frozen fields, bright lines that were beautiful if you didn't think about what they meant, and Rybalko's formation was spreading out, tanks separating to make targeting harder, each commander making independent decisions about spacing and speed. The German defensive positions were firing blind, shooting at engine sounds and silhouettes, and accuracy was terrible, but volume of fire was high enough that probability was working in their favour. The first tank was hit 30 seconds later. Rybalko saw it through his periscope, a T-34 taking a direct hit on the turret, the impact sound carrying across the field, and the tank rolling to a stop with its turret jammed. The crew was bailing out, moving with the practiced speed of veterans, and they were running toward the nearest functioning tank before German infantry could range in on their position. Rybalko could see trucks, stacked crates, the organised geometry of a logistics hub that was about to stop being organised. The German defenders were forming up, infantry moving into positions, anti-tank guns being wheeled around to face the unexpected threat, and Rybalko's formation was accelerating, engines being pushed past sustainable speeds because sustainability was irrelevant when you were 300 metres from impact. His gunner was already selecting targets, the lead German anti-tank gun, the emplaced machine gun position covering the approach, the command vehicle with its distinctive antenna array. Targets were being distributed across the formation via radio, each tank commander acknowledging assigned objectives, and the coordination was happening at speeds that German staff officers would later describe as impossible because Soviet tank armies weren't supposed to operate with that level of tactical flexibility. The first rounds were fired at 200 metres, Rybalko's gunner putting a 76mm shell through the front plate of a German anti-tank gun before it could fully traverse. The explosion spectacular in a way that meant ammunition was cooking off, and the German defensive line was collapsing before it fully formed, because defence requires time, and Rybalko had stolen their time. The breakthrough took 11 minutes. German infantry retreating in disorder, vehicles burning, supplies abandoned as defenders prioritised survival over mission. Rybalko's tanks were rolling into the depot complex, crushing defensive positions under their tracks, and his infantry were dismounting from their riding positions to secure buildings while tank commanders provided covering fire. The coordination was automatic, practiced over dozens of similar operations, and it worked because everyone understood their role and trusted their commander's timing. The sun was fully above the horizon when Rybalko stood on his tank and surveyed the captured depot. 40 tanks remaining operational, 3 destroyed, 4 damaged but recoverable. The mathematics of armour warfare expressed in burning steel and captured supplies. The German radio traffic was frantic now, overlapping voices calling for reinforcements and reporting the breakthrough and trying to understand how Soviet armour had appeared 12 kilometres behind their defensive line before dawn. Rybalko's staff officers were already cataloguing the captured supplies. Fuel, ammunition, medical supplies, food, maps showing German defensive positions for the next 50 kilometres. The intelligence value alone justified the operation, but Rybalko was already planning the next move, the next impossible advance, because the principle was simple. Keep moving faster than German intelligence could track, hit harder than German defenders expected, never stop long enough for the enemy to establish proper defensive lines. A German officer was brought to him 30 minutes later. Captain, maybe 30 years old, captured while trying to destroy documents in a command vehicle. The officer spoke through a translator, demanding to know how Soviet tanks had gotten behind German lines so quickly, what route they had taken, what reconnaissance they had performed. The questions revealed German assumptions about Soviet capabilities, and those assumptions were wrong in ways that made Rybalko's tactics possible. Rybalko's response was given through the same translator. No special route, no extended reconnaissance, just speed, aggression, and a willingness to push equipment past rated capacity and accept casualties that more cautious commanders would consider unacceptable. The German officer's expression said he didn't believe the explanation, which was fine because disbelief meant German intelligence would continue underestimating what Rybalko's formations could achieve. The captured maps showed German defensive positions organized in a linear pattern, each position expecting attack from predictable directions. Staff planning that prioritized orderly defensive lines over flexible response. The kind of thinking that worked against conventional attacks but collapsed when facing an enemy willing to accept mechanical failures and casualties in exchange for speed and surprise. Rybalko was already marking new objectives on his own maps, looking for the next logistics hub, the next defensive position that expected safety, because it was located behind what German planners considered secure lines. His tank army had covered 400 kilometers in 3 weeks. The distance wasn't exceptional by itself, but the terrain was winter mud. The vehicles were operating beyond their maintenance schedules, and German intelligence kept revising their estimates of Soviet positions, because Rybalko's formations kept appearing in locations where they weren't supposed to be possible. The German operational maps were becoming increasingly inaccurate, dotted with question marks and speculation about Soviet capabilities that exceeded German understanding of what mechanized warfare could achieve. The advance resumed after 4 hours, enough time to refuel from captured German stores, enough time to redistribute ammunition, enough time to perform minimal maintenance on vehicles that were operating with transmissions held together by improvisation and hope. Rybalko's orders came over the radio at noon. The next objective was 20 kilometers northwest, another German supply depot that intelligence reported was lightly defended because German commanders assumed it was safely behind their lines. The column formation was different now. 37 functioning tanks after 3 more mechanical failures that morning. Rybalko was riding in a different vehicle again, his third tank of the operation, and the crew were veterans who had served with him since the previous autumn. They knew his habits, his timing, his tendency to appear calm while making decisions that other officers would consider insane. The gunner was already ranging potential targets before targets were visible. The driver was watching temperature gauges and listening to engine sounds with the focus of someone whose survival depended on mechanical awareness. German resistance at the next depot was heavier than intelligence predicted. Anti-tank positions were already in place when Rybalko's formation arrived, and defensive coordination was better than the previous engagement. The German commander had 20 minutes warning, enough time to position his forces properly, and the initial assault stalled when 3 Soviet tanks were disabled in the first minute of contact. Rybalko was reassessing in real time, watching the defensive pattern, identifying the strong points, looking for the weakness that every defensive position contained. The weakness was on the northern flank where German infantry were spread thin, covering a wide frontage. Rybalko redirected 15 tanks to that sector, concentrating force against the thinnest part of the defensive line, and the breakthrough came after 7 minutes of sustained fire. German infantry breaking and retreating as Soviet armor rolled through their positions, and the defensive line collapsing from the flank inward as commanders realized their position was being enveloped. The cost was 8 tanks destroyed and 4 more damaged. Rybalko's formation was down to 25 operational vehicles, and maintenance officers were reporting that half the remaining tanks had mechanical issues that would become critical within the next 12 hours. The mathematics were approaching unsustainable, but Rybalko was looking at captured German maps and seeing opportunities that wouldn't exist if he stopped to consolidate his position. A German reconnaissance aircraft spotted his formation that afternoon. Rybalko watched it circle overhead, safely out of anti-aircraft range, and knew that accurate position reports were being radioed to German headquarters. The next 12 hours would be critical. German forces would be repositioned to intercept his advance, defensive lines would be reinforced, and the window for exploitation would close. Rybalko's decision was immediate. The column would advance through the night despite mechanical issues and crew fatigue, because stopping meant losing the initiative that made his tactics effective. The night advance was chaos managed through experience. Tanks moving without lights, navigating by compass and terrain features, and collisions were prevented only because crew commanders knew to watch for the dim silhouette of the vehicle ahead. 2 tanks through tracks in the darkness, 1 engine seized from overheating. Rybalko's formation was bleeding vehicles to mechanical attrition, but they were covering ground faster than German intelligence could coordinate an effective response. Dawn found them 18 kilometers beyond German defensive lines, in a position that German staff officers had marked as secure territory on their operational maps. Rybalko's 22 remaining tanks were formed up outside a German logistics centre that showed no signs of heightened alert. The element of surprise was complete in a way that seemed impossible given the previous day's reconnaissance flight, but German command systems were slower than Soviet tank columns, and Rybalko understood how to exploit that lag in decision-making. The attack was over before German reinforcements could arrive. Rybalko's tanks rolling through defensive positions that were designed to stop attacks from the east, but which offered no protection against. His formation was down to 17 operational vehicles, and fuel supplies were becoming critical despite captured German stores. The mathematics were clear. 1 more major engagement would reduce his force below operational viability, but stopping meant surrendering the initiative that had carried him 450 kilometers in less than a month. Soviet High Command contacted him that evening via radio. Orders to halt and consolidate position while reinforcements moved up to support his advanced position. Standard military procedure for a formation that had outrun its supply lines and operated beyond supporting distance from the main Soviet force. Rybalko acknowledged the orders and then ignored them, issuing instructions to his remaining tank commanders to prepare for another night advance. His justification was simple when he later reported to his superiors. German defensive lines were collapsing because German commanders couldn't coordinate responses to threats that moved faster than their communication systems. Every day, Rybalko's formation remained mobile was another day of German confusion, another day of captured supplies and intelligence, another day of German resources being diverted to respond to a threat that kept appearing in unexpected locations. Stopping meant giving German forces time to reorganize and establish defensive positions that would cost Soviet lives to overcome. The advance continued for another week. Rybalko's formation was reinforced by elements that caught up to his position, bringing his operational strength back up to 30 tanks, and the pattern repeated: rapid advances, surprise attacks on rear area logistics centers, captured supplies fueling further advances, and German intelligence reports that grew increasingly confused about Soviet capabilities and intentions. German after-action reports from this period showed a pattern of disbelief. Soviet tank armies weren't supposed to operate at these speeds. Mechanical reliability should have limited advance rates. Supply line logistics should have forced operational pauses. But Rybalko's formation kept moving, kept hitting targets, kept appearing in locations where German staff officers insisted Soviet armor couldn't possibly reach. The explanation was simpler than German intelligence wanted to believe. Rybalko accepted mechanical attrition rates that conventional doctrine considered unacceptable. He pushed crews beyond normal fatigue limits. He used captured German supplies to sustain advances that Soviet logistics couldn't support. And he made decisions faster than German staff systems could respond to those decisions. The tactics weren't revolutionary. They were just executed with a level of aggression and speed that German operational planning didn't accommodate. A German general was captured during this period, taken from a command vehicle that Rybalko's advance guard encountered on a road that German intelligence had marked as secure. The general spent 3 hours being interrogated by Soviet intelligence officers, and his testimony revealed the psychological impact of Rybalko's operations. German commanders were second-guessing their intelligence, doubting their defensive planning, and requesting reinforcements to counter threats that often disappeared before reinforcements arrived. The operational chaos was as valuable as the captured supplies. Rybalko's tanks reached their furthest advance point in late January 1944, 500 kilometers beyond their starting position, operating in territory that German maps showed as rear area security zones. His formation had been reduced to 12 operational tanks through combat losses and mechanical attrition, but those 12 tanks were sitting on a strategic crossroads that German logistics required for their defensive operations. Soviet reinforcements were 3 days behind, moving up to consolidate the position Rybalko had captured, and German counterattacks were being organized to retake the crossroads before it could be reinforced. The defense of that crossroads lasted 4 days. Rybalko's 12 tanks versus rotating German attacks that sometimes included 50 or more armoured vehicles. The mathematics should have been impossible, but Rybalko held the position through a combination of superior positioning, aggressive counterattacks that disrupted German formations before they could fully deploy, and a willingness to accept casualties that kept German commanders off balance. By the time Soviet reinforcements arrived, Rybalko's formation was down to 6 operational tanks, but the crossroads remained in Soviet hands. German intelligence reports from this period showed a shift in assessment. Soviet tank commander Rybalko was no longer described as reckless or suicidal. The new assessments used terms like highly effective and extremely dangerous and requires priority attention. Rybalko's tactics were being studied by German staff officers, and defensive planning was being adjusted to account for Soviet formations that moved faster and hit harder than doctrine suggested was possible. The cost of those tactics was measured in destroyed tanks and exhausted crews. Rybalko's original formation of 43 tanks had been reduced through attrition to a point where most vehicles were total losses, destroyed in combat, or abandoned after mechanical failure. The human cost was proportionally lower. Tank crews were trained to bail out quickly and transfer to other vehicles, and Rybalko's emphasis on speed meant that wounded could often be evacuated before German forces could reach disabled vehicles. Soviet High Command awarded Rybalko the Order of Lenin for the operation. The citation mentioned the distance covered, the supplies captured, the strategic crossroads secured, but it didn't mention the mechanical attrition rates or the number of tanks lost to non-combat causes. Those statistics were recorded in maintenance logs that showed Rybalko's formations operated at loss rates that would have court-martialed less successful commanders. German defensive planning changed after Rybalko's winter offensive. Linear defensive lines were reinforced with mobile reserves positioned to respond to breakthroughs. Logistics centres in rear areas received increased security. Intelligence gathering was intensified to provide earlier warning of Soviet tank concentrations. The adjustments were recognition that Soviet armour doctrine had evolved beyond German understanding, and commanders like Rybalko were exploiting that evolution with terrifying effectiveness. Rybalko's next major operation came 3 months later during the Soviet Spring Offensive. His tactics were similar but refined based on winter experience. Tank armies moving in multiple columns to confuse German intelligence about primary axis of advance. Night movements to minimize exposure to German air reconnaissance. Aggressive exploitation of any breakthrough before German forces could establish new defensive lines. The pattern was consistent. Move faster than enemy can respond. Hit harder than enemy expects. never give enemy time to establish prepared defences. The advance toward Kiev in late 1943 had shown the template. The winter operations had refined the execution. The spring offensive demonstrated that Rybalko's tactics could be sustained over multiple operations despite increasing German awareness and improved German defensive preparations. Soviet tank armies were operating with a level of operational tempo that German forces couldn't match, and commanders like Rybalko were the reason that tempo was possible. German prisoners captured during this period consistently mentioned fear of Soviet tank breakthroughs. The fear wasn't based on Soviet technological superiority. German tank designs were often superior on paper, but on Soviet willingness to accept losses and operate at speeds that German doctrine considered impossible. Rybalko's name appeared in German intelligence briefs with increasing frequency, and defensive planning specifically mentioned the need to respond more quickly to Soviet armor movements to prevent exploitation. Rybalko's formation reached the outskirts of Prague in May 1945. The final advance of the European War covered 2,000 kilometers from Soviet territory to the heart of German-occupied Czechoslovakia, and Rybalko's forces were among the first Soviet units to make contact with Czech resistance fighters. The liberation of Prague was coordinated chaos, Soviet tanks arriving ahead of schedule and German forces retreating in disorder, and Rybalko's reputation as a commander who moved faster than possible was confirmed one final time. The final accounting of his operations showed statistics that German staff officers found difficult to believe. Average advance rates that exceeded what German intelligence considered mechanically possible for Soviet armor. Casualty ratios that favored Soviet forces despite German defensive advantages. Captured supplies that sustained operations beyond what Soviet logistics alone could have supported. The numbers were real, verified through captured German documents and post-war analysis, but they represented a style of warfare that German operational planning hadn't effectively countered. Rybalko's career after the war was spent training the next generation of Soviet tank commanders. His lectures emphasized speed over caution, aggression over consolidation, and exploitation over defensive security. The doctrine he developed during World War II became template for Soviet armor operations during the Cold War, and his tactical principles influenced armored warfare thinking across multiple nations. German military historians studying his operations consistently noted that his success came from willingness to accept risks and losses that conventional doctrine rejected. The question that German analysts kept returning to was simple. Why didn't more Soviet commanders operate like Rybalko if his tactics were so effective? The answer was complex, involving personality, command authority, and institutional tolerance for high attrition rates. Rybalko succeeded because he had the aggressive personality required for his tactics, because Soviet high command gave him freedom to operate independently, and because he produced results that justified casualty rates that would have ended other commanders' careers. The final German intelligence assessment of Rybalko came in a captured document dated April 1945. The assessment concluded that he represented a type of Soviet commander that German forces were poorly equipped to counter, operationally flexible, tactically aggressive, strategically opportunistic, and unconstrained by conventional concern for mechanical attrition or casualty rates. The document recommended that any defensive planning should assume Soviet forces under commanders like Rybalko would move twice as fast and hit twice as hard as doctrine suggested was possible. That assessment was proven accurate during the Soviet advance into Germany in 1945. Rybalko's tank army was consistently ahead of schedule, consistently achieving objectives before German defences could fully form, and consistently exploiting breakthroughs with speed that German counterattack planning couldn't accommodate. The pattern held until the war ended. Soviet tanks in Prague before German commanders believed they could possibly arrive, and Rybalko's formation having covered distances that German staff officers had calculated should require another 2 weeks to traverse. His legacy in Soviet military history was complicated by the costs of his methods. High mechanical attrition meant constant need for replacement vehicles. Crew fatigue meant rotation requirements that strained personnel systems. Casualty rates were acceptable in context of strategic results achieved, but were higher than other Soviet commanders operating similar forces. The effectiveness was undeniable, but the sustainability was questioned by staff officers who had to manage logistics and replacements. The tactical principles endured despite questions about sustainability: speed as weapon, surprise as force multiplier, aggression as doctrine. Rybalko's methods became case studies in military academies, analysed for what they revealed about the relationship between risk acceptance and operational effectiveness. German defensive failures during 1943-1945 were often attributed to Soviet commanders like Rybalko, who operated outside conventional constraints and achieved results that conventional planning suggested were impossible. The statistical record showed the pattern clearly. Rybalko's formations consistently advanced faster, penetrated deeper, and caused more operational disruption than comparable Soviet units. The costs in vehicles and casualties were proportionally higher, but the strategic results justified those costs in ways that made his career possible, despite institutional resistance to his methods. He succeeded because he was willing to break things: tanks, conventional doctrine, German defensive planning, and because Soviet High Command eventually recognized that breaking things at Rybalko's pace was worth the price being paid. German commanders captured after the war consistently mentioned Rybalko when asked about effective Soviet opposition. The mentions weren't about specific battles or tactical brilliance, but about the psychological impact of facing an opponent who moved faster than thought possible and who kept appearing where defenses were weakest. The fear was operational, not fear of being defeated in battle, but fear that defensive planning was meaningless against an enemy who ignored the constraints that defensive planning assumed were universal. That fear was Rybalko's greatest achievement. Not the distances covered or supplies captured or positions seized, but the German uncertainty about where Soviet armour could appear and how quickly it could arrive. Uncertainty forced German commanders to spread forces thinner, establish deeper defensive reserves, and dedicate resources to rear area security that should have been available for front-line operations. Rybalko's operational style created strategic effects that extended far beyond the immediate tactical results of his advances. The final measure of his impact came from Soviet operational planning in the war's final year. Rybalko's methods became template for multiple tank armies, and Soviet offensive operations increasingly emphasized. His crews practiced night movements until they could navigate in complete darkness, practiced rapid refueling until they could complete the process in minutes rather than hours, and practiced emergency repairs under simulated combat conditions until mechanical improvisation became automatic. The training was demanding enough that some crews requested transfers to other units, but those who remained developed capabilities that made Rybalko's operational tempo possible. German prisoners consistently mentioned the speed of Soviet tank movements as something that exceeded what their training had prepared them to counter. The relationship between Rybalko and his immediate superiors was complicated by his methods. Soviet High Command valued his results, but worried about his casualty rates and his tendency to operate beyond supporting distance from main Soviet forces. Rybalko received reprimands for unauthorized advances and for ignoring orders to halt and consolidate, but the reprimands were always followed by new assignments because his tactical successes were too valuable to sideline. The pattern suggested that Soviet command had decided to tolerate Rybalko's independence as long as he continued producing results, a pragmatic accommodation that other commanders noted and sometimes attempted to emulate. The propaganda value of Rybalko's operations was significant for Soviet morale and information campaigns. Soviet media highlighted his rapid advances as evidence of Red Army superiority and German weakness, and Rybalko's name became known to Soviet civilians in ways that most military commanders never achieved. The propaganda wasn't entirely accurate. It emphasized victories while minimizing costs, but it served strategic purposes by maintaining home front morale and by creating psychological pressure on German forces who heard Soviet broadcasts claiming that unstoppable tank armies were advancing on all fronts. The logistics innovations that made Rybalko's tempo possible were studied by Soviet military planners for application to other units. His formations pioneered techniques for using captured German fuel and supplies to extend operational range, for prioritizing ammunition types that had maximum tactical utility over maintaining full standard loadouts, and for accepting higher mechanical failure rates in exchange for sustained operational momentum. Some techniques were adopted more widely, while others were deemed too risky for general implementation. The selective adoption suggested that Soviet command recognized Rybalko's methods worked for him, but might not work for commanders with different personalities or different levels of crew training. The German defensive adjustments to counter Rybalko's tactics evolved throughout the war, but never fully solved the problem he presented. German commanders tried establishing deeper defensive lines with more mobile reserves, but Rybalko's formations moved through gaps before reserves could effectively respond. German intelligence tried predicting his advance routes, but Rybalko's willingness to accept difficult terrain and mechanical risks meant he often chose routes that German planning dismissed as impassable. German forces tried concentrating armour to create killing zones, but Rybalko's practice of advancing in multiple columns made it difficult to achieve decisive concentration against any single axis of advance. The personal cost of Rybalko's command style was reflected in his relationships with subordinate commanders. Officers who served under him described an environment of constant pressure and high expectations, where initiative was rewarded but failure was harshly criticized. Some subordinates thrived in that environment and went on to successful independent commands, while others requested transfers to less demanding assignments. Rybalko's command style wasn't universally applicable, but it worked for the type of operations he conducted and for the commanders who could match his operational tempo and accept his risk tolerance. The final major engagement of Rybalko's career came during the Prague Offensive in May 1945, when his forces conducted a rapid advance against collapsing German resistance to reach the city before Western Allied forces. The advance covered over 200 kilometers in less than a week, exemplifying the operational characteristics that defined Rybalko's entire war. Speed prioritized over security, exploitation emphasized over consolidation, and aggressive pursuit of objectives regardless of conventional risk calculations. The Prague operation succeeded in its strategic objective of establishing Soviet presence in the city before Western forces arrived, and that success validated the continued use of Rybalko's aggressive methods even in the war's final days. The reception of Rybalko's forces in Prague demonstrated the complexity of liberation operations. Czech civilians welcomed Soviet forces as liberators from German occupation, but the rapid nature of Rybalko's advance meant that his forces had limited supplies for civilian relief and limited time for organized interaction with the population they were liberating. The tanks rolled through Prague and continued pursuing retreating German forces, leaving occupation and relief operations to follow-on forces. The pattern was characteristic of Rybalko's approach. Operational momentum took priority over consolidation, and the human dimensions of liberation were secondary considerations to the military objective of maintaining pressure on German forces. The statistical comparison between Rybalko's operations and those of other Soviet tank army commanders revealed the distinctiveness of his approach. His forces advanced faster, covered more ground per day, and achieved surprise more consistently than comparable Soviet units. The costs in vehicles and casualties were also higher, but the ratio of strategic results to costs was favorable enough that Soviet High Command continued supporting his methods. The statistics demonstrated that Rybalko's approach wasn't just about accepting higher risks, it was about achieving higher returns that justified those risks in strategic calculation. His name entered German military vocabulary as shorthand for a type of threat that required special consideration. Rybalko-style advance appeared in German staff planning documents as descriptor for Soviet operations that exceeded normal tempo and required faster defensive response than standard procedures provided. The recognition was implicit acknowledgement that Rybalko had changed German understanding of what Soviet armor could achieve, and that change forced adaptation in ways that weakened overall German defensive capability. The final accounting showed a career measured in kilometers, advanced and strategic positions captured. 500 kilometers in 3 weeks during winter, 1944. 800 kilometers in 6 weeks during spring offensive. 2,000 kilometers total by war's end. The distances represented something beyond mere movement. They represented sustained operational pressure that German forces couldn't effectively counter, maintained at costs that Soviet command considered acceptable given strategic results achieved. Rybalko received his final combat promotion to Marshal in March 1945, recognition for operations that had brought Soviet forces from Kursk to Prague in less than 2 years. The promotion came with command of a tank army group for the final push into Germany, and his forces were among the first Soviet units to make contact with American forces as the war in Europe ended. The meeting of forces was anticlimactic after the sustained intensity of his advance, but it marked the conclusion of operations that had demonstrated what Soviet armor doctrine could achieve when executed with maximum aggression and minimal concern for conventional constraints. The conversation that ended the war for Rybalko's forces came from Soviet High Command via radio on May 8, 1945. Orders to halt all offensive operations, secure current positions, and await further instructions as Germany's surrender was being finalized. Rybalko's formation was west of Prague, still in motion despite the orders, because momentum was difficult to stop after 2 years of sustained advance. The final tank movements of his war came as crews coasted to stops and shut down engines that had been running continuously for days, and the silence that followed was strange after so long hearing the sound of tracks on frozen earth and engines pushed past their operational limits. German intelligence officers analyzing Soviet operations after the war consistently identified Rybalko as representative of Soviet armor doctrine at its most effective. The analysis noted his willingness to trade mechanical reliability for speed, accept casualties for surprise, and prioritize exploitation over consolidation. The traits that made him effective also made him dangerous to his own forces, but Soviet command systems tolerated those dangers because strategic results justified tactical costs. Rybalko's career demonstrated that operational doctrine wasn't fixed by equipment limitations or casualty concerns. It was defined by commanders' willingness to push beyond institutional boundaries and command authorities' willingness to accept results despite costs.